Previously on CivicSciTV Africa with Stephanie Okeo.
It's the first of its kind. That's like the first project that we're doing together. But there was something that resonated with this initiative. Justin didn't. He didn't. He was preaching to us that he didn't want it to be like any other kind of SciComm fellowship.
Subscribe to access that conversation and many more.
Welcome to the CivicSciTV Africa. Today we are joined by Dr. Elizabeth Rasekoala. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth, for joining us. Dr. Elizabeth Rasekoala is the President of African Gong. African Gong is a Pan-African network for the popularization of science and technology and science communication. She is a veteran science communication practitioner and scholar, and is the editor of the award-winning influential new book, Race and Sociocultural Inclusion in Science Communication, Innovation, Decolonisation, and Transformation. This book assembled 30 diverse practitioners and academics from across the global South and North to present empowering ideas and transformative concepts about inclusive science communication. Elizabeth is ambitious in seeking to harness mutual learning, equity, and decolonizing approaches across the global North-South divide in order to advance global inclusive knowledge paradigms and diverse knowledge-sharing practices that engender public trust in science. She is the 2019 recipient of the International NAT Award for Science Communication, conferred by the National Science Museum of Barcelona. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for having me. This is a really exciting invitation, and I look forward to our discussion and elaborations. Thank you.
So, Dr. Elizabeth, even before we dive deep, so your work has always focused on social, cultural, and gender inclusion. They have been pivotal topics in your work. What drew you to these areas, and why do they matter to you, both professionally and personally?
Thank you for this question, because I think it's always important that we revisit or we rethink the foundational drivers of why we do what we do. And this question took me to those foundational places on a personal and professional level. And on a personal level, it's what has driven me to this work is the growing and sharpening contrast between my childhood and formative years on the African continent as an African child growing up in a family where my scientific curiosity, interest, and education were so very much supported by my parents. There are 6 of us in my family, 4 females and 2 males, and we are all in STEM, equally empowered, equally encouraged by both my parents. So that was my background. And furthermore, I was grounded and steeped within an empowering Afrocentric mindset, so that I was very aware of myself at an early age as an African scientist. Wow. And there was no conflict between my science and my African indigenous knowledge. So from very early on, these affirming experiences, and also being enhanced within a societal context, where, as I put it, and you know this, if you go to the hospital, guess what? The doctors look like you, the nurses look like you, the cleaners look like you. So you can make a real informed choice as to who or what you want to be in terms of role modeling that is not determined by race or Eurocentric constructs. And so in thinking back, I then realized that these formative years had prepared and set me on this progressive path to decolonization and sociocultural inclusion. And then what happens? you go on your professional journey now and into that professional space, I began to see a jarring conflict between my formative personal experiences when I moved to the UK in the late 1980s for postgraduate study and then further into the workplace. And then for the first time in my life, I experienced the lived experience of the transition from being African to being Black. Well, I never knew I was Black. Yeah, I saw myself, I was always an African. And what being Black means in society at different levels and in different contexts. I also experienced at first hand the contradictions of these constructs in British society and in the education system. So on the one hand, you have a so-called world-class education system that enables African students like myself to come in at postgraduate level in STEM and to excel. And yet, at the undergraduate level, in my department in chemical engineering, there wasn't a single Black British student, not one, in the 3-year undergraduate program. Wow. That was a shock. That huge contradiction between a very diverse postgraduate cohort of students, and then you look at the undergraduate cohorts, which are local students, and you see that huge divergence. So that was when you begin to experience this conflict. And I then had to go and revisit my previous experiences as an African youth growing up, and that empowerment and affirmation. And you then start learning and talking and engaging with other people to try and understand, how is this possible? How is this constructed? And the first thing you come across is that this is a systematic framework.
Yeah.
It's systematic. And you see it, you begin to unpick it at different levels of society and the different players that come into play. And being the disciplined person that I was, I said to myself, don't judge, you learn and you understand. And so for me, the discipline of learning to understand meant that I had to come to the reality check, a bit of what I'd call the humility space, to say that my chemical engineering study and knowledge was not enough to enable me to understand what I was seeing and experiencing. So for the first time, I went on a journey of what I call multidisciplinarity. I took on that agenda for myself. I started to engage with social scientists. I started to engage with people in philosophy to understand, how does a society construct these racial disparities in such subtle and insidiously powerful frameworks, and sustain them. So that was the beginning of my journey into this whole intersection of science communication, the scientific enterprise, as I call it, and social justice issues. And it has been a very profound learning journey. And I'm still on that journey. And I urge all of us to really, as scientists, to read beyond our, sort of natural or physical science fields, to engage with our social science colleagues, to engage with our colleagues in other scientific fields, the humanities, so that we can better understand what it is that we're dealing with. Because if you don't understand it in such a systematic and multi-dimensioned framework, you will find it very difficult to deal with both on a personal level and on a professional level. So for me, this extensive literature search and learning enabled me to understand just how complex and multi-layered the scaffolding that holds up this systematic framework of sociocultural exclusion and racial inequality is, and how insidiously its footprint is sustained.
Mhm.
So here was a sharp contrast between my personal and professional journey, and then wrapping that up to say, Elizabeth, where do you go from here? And where did I go from there? I came to the understanding that these issues have to be a parallel focus of my work alongside my professional work as a chemical engineer in industry. Because on a personal level, given the affirming and empowering experiences of my childhood and formative years, I felt the need to contribute to and support the work of others in these intersections of the scientific enterprise and social justice issues in order to give back and to be a role model for others. And on a professional level, I became very much convinced, given what I describe as of myself as being a critical friend of science, that while scientific advancement has much to offer to the development of society and human well-being, the benefits of this critical endeavor would be of limited impact if these systematic inequalities were not addressed. So I then came to this synergy between my personal and professional commitment as to why it matters that one and all of us should engage on these issues of sociocultural inclusion and equity in science and science communication. So it's been a journey, it's been a process, but finally I was able to pull them together, and that has been the journey that I've been on past 30 years.
So it is interesting how you're able to connect how your personal and professional life are interlinked. And you've talked about race, inequality, society, and your book has all those components in it with the title Race and Sociocultural Inclusion in Science Communication. I must say I have a copy here and it's been an interesting read, but I will not want to dive in it. So could you tell us why this book and why now?
Again, another intriguing question. And here the answer, I'm pleased to say, is very simple, because we have a saying that timing is everything. And this book is very much of its time. It could not have been written before this time, because then I don't think it would have been have well received as it has been. And why do I say this book is very much of its time? Because it was forged during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the global inequalities and divides inherent in the scientific enterprise and its communication were illuminated, interrogated, and challenged like never before. This was a big deal for science and its communication. We haven't been here for many, many decades. And so during this time of flux, contestations, and paradigm shifting agendas, many of us who had been working on advancing inclusive science communication realized that here was a unique opportunity to address the many elephants in the room. meaning the realization that the science communication field needed to move beyond the limited scope of what inclusive science communication had become. We realized that we were all sitting in a false comfort zone and that the field needed to move even further in order to deliver a truly globally inclusive agenda that had been so glaringly exposed during the COVID pandemic. So these junctures, the nexuses of the socio-political, cultural imperatives across the global North and South that the COVID pandemic made so glaringly obvious within that North-South divide were just so glaringly obvious that a book like this had to be written to bring clarity, synergy, illumination to challenge the science communication field. I always go back to a British phrase quip about do not let a crisis go to waste. So for us, the COVID pandemic crisis was one that was ideally the timing for a book like this to be written. And we can see that the timing indeed paid off in terms of how the book has been received, the responses, and the relatability, because people could see and had experienced many of those dichotomies and inequalities and insidious equity challenges in their lived experiences. So that's a simple answer. And for someone like me who's been a veteran in this field, it's a painful truth for me to say that this book could not have been written before COVID.
Yeah.
The field was just not ready. People were so in their comfort zone of slogans and acronyms and yes. And really, they were not gonna be shaken up. But COVID had already done the shaking up. And what we then had to do was to help people to make sense of what that shaking up actually meant, and to let people know that this shaking up has not happened in a vacuum. There's a context to this. There's a history to this. There's a footprint to this. So the book was just able to sit and fit so nicely within those global awakenings and challenges, and to help to make sense of it all. Yes.
And Dr. Elizabeth, for the book, who would you consider your target audience, and what do you hope the reader gets from this?
In terms of the target audience, it has been varied, and it was planned to be varied. Well, first of all, at the foreground, science communication practitioners, researchers, academic scholars, and the institutions in which they work, science centers and science museums, as well as in different STEM institutions and universities, science communication networks across the global North and South. But another critical constituency, target audience for us in this book, given the COVID pandemic scenario, was public health practitioners. And we saw that at first hand, especially on the African continent, given the limited footprint of science communication, of the need for us as science communicators to work with public health practitioners. So for us, we saw them as part of the target audience for this book. Another critical target audience, again, given the challenges in the global South, was that of policymakers. We know how challenging the policymaking space for science communication is, for example, on the African continent and in many parts of the global South compared to in the global North regions. So we realized that this book also had to speak to policymakers, to challenge them, and to encourage them to really lift their game, particularly across the North-South divide. So those really were the key audiences for the book.
And it is interesting.
And in terms of the key takeaways, sorry, go on. Mm-hmm.
No, it's interesting to have these different lenses on your audience and how they are interconnected in the science space. So, as a reader, as someone who wrote that book, when I finish this book, what do you hope I will get from it?
I wanted folks to get a host of takeaways. But if I was to distill them into 3 critical contexts, the first one is for the audience and the readers to really understand the imperatives of a post-COVID world where the spotlight on science and its communication are much sharper and critical, and how this places pressing demands on the science communication field for inclusive and pluralistic discourses and impactful delivery on equity of access and engagement, and engendering narratives that contextualize science in a diversity of cultures. Mm-hmm. And really, people have to understand out there that the genie is out of the box. We are not going to go back to where we were pre-COVID. And I say that in spite of all the current challenges and all the current turbulences and all the current developments and dynamics that we're seeing in some parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. And
we will not go back. And we know, and I say that on 2 levels. We are not going to go back because people are not going to forget what they have lived and seen in COVID. Millions of people across the world have died. Millions of lives have been impacted. You are not going to wish that away.
Yeah.
That sits in people's memory. And secondly, we know, and the World Health Organization says this all the time, that given the growing impact of climate change, this is our future. The next pandemic is only round the corner. We don't know where or how it will start, but we know that its spread, it's only one plane ride away. That's how interconnected our world is. So for those who think that you can take us back to where we were, it's not going to happen. Yeah.
It's a shared lived experience that we can't shake from.
Absolutely. Yes. And then following on from that, we would want readers to understand that this transition is highly critical if science communication practices and public engagement experiences are to be relevant, relatable, and able to embark their diverse local communities on a journey to situate scientific knowledge in their daily lived experiences and cultural contexts, and therefore enhance public trust in science. This is a key goal for us with this book. And what we're saying is that part of the problem that we have with public trust in science is about admitting that we, science communicators and scientists, in a sense, have been part of the problem rather than just being part of the solution. And we have to have the humility to look within ourselves, to look within our field. We're very good at pointing fingers out at the public. Oh, they don't want science. Oh, they're not interested in science. Oh, they don't want to take science seriously. Yes, there might be a certain element of that in the public. But we also have to interrogate ourselves to say, how do we relate to the public? How do we understand? How do we create narratives that are inclusive, that enable people to put science in their sociocultural context, because that's their lived lives. That's their lived experiences, rather than this arrogant top-down approach, where as scientists, we treat the public as if they're empty vessels. So what we call the deficit model that has almost become standard in the field. And finally, we're very hopeful that the action-oriented and evidence-based recommendations in the book, if strategically and systematically applied, can enable the science communication field to make the globally inclusive transformation leaps that will make it fit for the diverse world of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And people have to remember we are in the 21st century, and the world has never been more diverse. And we need to enable science communication then in this century to engage citizens in navigating scientific knowledge that is relevant to all, engages all, and empowers all within a dynamic, inclusive sociocultural framework. So those are the key takeaways and the key drivers that we would want readers and the audiences to take from the book. And we're very hopeful that these will help to transform the field and make us much better able to tackle the challenges of the 21st century. And there are huge challenges, as we know.
It is such an interconnected system whereby science is not happening in silo, and also reflection of what is our role and impact within this whole system that we sit in.
And for us as scientists to stop finger pointing and to actually take ownership of some of those problems, and to own the fact that we have also contributed to some of those problems, rather than simply pointing the fingers at the publics all the time. We have a role to play, but that can only happen if we have the humility and self-awareness to ask ourselves, how am I part of the problem? How is my practice part of the problem? And how can I change so that I can help to solve the problem? Mm-hmm. And that is very difficult for many of us to do, because we sit in a very arrogant, superior knowledge space. And for many of our colleagues, it's very, very difficult to go on that transformative journey. And we know it.
And from a self-reflection of the science space to a self-reflection as an editor, what key insights did you get in editing this book?
I got so many insights, but I think for me, the three critical ones, and which I know that even many of my colleagues in the Global South are still challenged by, is the first one was this understanding of the pervasive and institutionalized challenge of the decolonization agenda across both the global North and South, and which is inherent in institutions and practitioners in both regions. So it was very striking for me that many of us in the Global South had been in a comfort zone where we were happy to finger point decolonization as an imperative for the Global North. But what this book did, and one of the critical insights, was to debunk this myth that decolonization is only an issue for the Global North. And what this book is saying is that we in the Global South also need to decolonize. We need to accept that we have assimilated many of these Eurocentric dominant narratives and traditions, either through our science education system or through whatever socio-political legacies of the colonial era. Mm-hmm. And that is a very difficult thing for men in the global south to deal with. So what then came from that awareness is what I describe as an equal opportunity challenge. So for me, the insight led me to this understanding that here we have an equal opportunity challenge for both global North and South in driving forward the decolonization agenda, and that we should actually see it in a positive light as a bridge building platform for creating innovative and equitable collaboration partnerships to deliver systematic change in inclusive science communication across both regions. So here we have actually a unique challenge that is across both regions that should actually be something that brings us together in a kind of a unity space to say, we have an equal problem. We have a shared challenge. How can we work together from different contexts and perspectives, obviously, to be able to deal with this challenge? So this was a unique insight for me in this book that I hadn't actually wrapped my head around in that full way. And the second one insight was this, what I call it, the kind of the umbilical cord, the systematic links between how scientific knowledge is researched and generated and how it is communicated. So meaning that scientific knowledge cannot be inclusively communicated when it has not also been inclusively generated, researched and advanced in the first place. So there'd always been this separation of, we do research and then we do communication. And in the inclusive science communication space, we had never actually made that joined up thinking. So that for me was another very interesting insight from the book, that here was another myth that was debunked, that there is a link. Inclusion just doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs to be part of a process. Yeah. And the third insight for me that was mind-changing was to understand the pernicious and growing footprint of global inequalities as to who benefits from the fruits of the scientific enterprise and how these perceived inequalities impact on public trust, perceptions, and deeply held concerns across the globe. Again, very insightful in making yet another link that the public are not stupid. The public are not sitting in places where they don't understand. They see both sides. So the inequalities of who benefits from the outputs of science really within the public space feed into that distrust of science, and it feeds into those concerns as to who and what is science for. And if as scientists and science communicators, we do not wrap our heads around those issues, we will keep failing to understand why and where the places where lack of public trust in science sit. So for me, that was a very insightful signpost from the book as to some of those pockets where lack of public trust in science sit. I hadn't actually made that connection myself, but I was able to get that insight from many of the chapters in the book.
It was a sense-making also process for you while putting all this together. Very interesting. Absolutely. From what you're saying. And as somebody actually who's read the book, there is one thing from your book that stood out for me. There in your chapter, you said there is still a long way to go before we even begin to realize a critical level playing field of a truly globally inclusive craft and footprint of science communication. That really stood out for me. So from where you stand, what steps do you think we need to take to move forward?
thank you for that. Yes, and that for me was a challenging statement to make, but I felt that it was a challenge that needed to be put out there to really make us think about the steps that we need to go forward. And in taking that forward, I felt that we needed to look at three critical areas. The first area we need to look at is, who are the publics? Science communication, it's all about, we talk about the publics, we talk about public engagement, but who are the publics? So the first, and that then means we need to ask a number of questions. The first question that we need to ask ourselves as science communicators is, who are the publics that we actually serve? And who are the publics that we purport or claim to serve? And then following on, yet another intriguing question. Which of these two publics do we reflect in the professional ranks of our practitioners? I love questions because when you ask questions, you then now have to, they lead you to some of where, as we say in my father's language, the dead bodies are buried. And these questions are intriguing in their analysis because they really do give the game away. So that we find in the science communication field that in actuality, it serves a very narrow, elitist, urban-based, and racially or ethnically privileged segment of society, while claiming to serve all of society. We say one thing, we do something else. And this actuality of who it serves is what is reflected in the makeup and representation of the science communication professionals and practitioners. So it's no accident that we see what we see. And what we don't understand when we complain about the lack of diversity in science communication practitioners is that in terms of the actual publics that it serves, that is not an issue. Yeah, it's not an issue. Because that narrow representation by race, by gender, by social class is precisely reflective of the very narrow elitist public that it actually serves. The problem comes, the disjuncture comes when you actually put that narrow representation of the professional ranks against the publics that it claims to serve. Then you see this big disconnection between who the practitioners are and the publics. And this is partly why we fail to be able to deliver to a diverse public. So until we can actually address and have a science communication field cadre of professionals that fully reflects the makeup and representation of the publics that we claim to serve, the real wider public out there, we will continue to struggle to deliver globally inclusive craft and footprint for science communication.
It is really asking yourself, when you say inclusive, who exactly are we talking about in this inclusion?
Exactly. And these are very profound questions that we don't ask ourselves because we don't want to go there. And we like to sit in this fiction that, yes, we're engaging all the publics, but actually we're not. We're not. Yeah.
Because the system itself.
Yes, that's what I mean. It's systematic. So you just have to look at who we are to know exactly which narrow sliver of the public we are actually serving.
Yeah. It's a giveaway. It's a giveaway. Yeah. The second element of the challenging steps we need to take forward is, again, to ask the question, what do we count as success in science communication? So here we're talking about how do we go from measuring success and impact measures, impact outcomes in science communication, from the simplistic indicators of quantity, raw numbers. How many people attended the event? How many people turned up? How many people registered? You know those things, all those numbers, which is the current and dominant way that we measure success, to change our paradigm to that of measuring quality measures, quality indicators, which is harder, but much more nuanced, transformative, and inclusive. And if we take this recommendation to its ultimate conclusion, what this means is that we should be talking about having only one valid impact measure for successful science communication, that of inclusivity. Can we be bold enough to envisage a brave new world where the metrics of social justice and inclusion indicators become the principal hallmarks through which we evaluate and assess what success outcomes in science communication look like and their sustainable impacts? As I said in the Inclusive Science Communication Symposium in Rhode Island in 2023, can we actually take our field to a place where we can say of any science communication, public engagement activity, if it is not inclusive, it is rubbish. Period. Case closed. If it is not inclusive, it is rubbish. Scrap it, bin it, we start all over.
A simple indicator, but it entails a lot of deep thinking and also investment.
Yeah, it is. Because for too long, inclusion has been seen as an optional extra, a nice to have after we've done everything else, we've counted the numbers, an afterthought. And until we put it at the center and the foreground of how we measure success in our field, it will continue to be an outlier.
And as a practitioner, because you've been in this space for decades, with your work in African Gong, what have you learned particularly about the African science communication landscape?
Thank you for that, because we seldom have the opportunity as African science communication practitioners to share with others the scenarios on our continent. So this is an excellent question. And what we find is that, unfortunately, for a number of reasons, historical, contemporary, the African science communication landscape is still very much a patchy space with an uneven footprint across national, sub-regional, and continental landscapes. In addition, it still largely operates in undecolonized and constrained scenarios, such that African science communicators find themselves having to navigate the profound gaps that exist in the system on many levels, such as the gaps between policy and practice, the gaps between policy, practice, and resources, funding. You and I have talked about this before. Challenges of capacity building, particularly for young and emerging scientists, and the gaps between the scientific elite holders of scientific knowledge and the general African public. And these operational and systematic challenges are evident in three key pillars.
The first one is in the policy arena. The policy-making arena for science in the continent is limited. And as we all know, if science communication is not fully framed and embedded in the policy space, we will struggle to get the resources, the funding that is needed to make it a living reality. So we can never discount the impact of the challenges in the policy arena in the African continent on the footprint of science communication on our continent. So very few African countries in the first place have policies in place for science communication. And of the few that do, very few of them have implementation plans and resources, funding budgets to go alongside those policy frameworks, so that we struggle to have the delivery of inclusive and impactful science communication across all 54 countries of the continent. And at the continental level, critical policy frameworks for science, like the African Union's Science, Technology and Innovation Strategy for Africa 2024, the so-called STISA 2024, which just concluded last year, and the extended STISA 2034, which is now being drafted, have both failed to fully frame, mainstream and articulate a clear and driving imperative for science communication on our continent. So it is unfortunate that key critical continental documents, policy frameworks like these for science, technology and innovation still fail to enable us to lift our game in the policy space. And what African Gong has done is to work with other key stakeholders across the continent to try to address these policy gaps through what we call bottom-up approaches. We may not be able to drive things from the top down, but bottom-up approaches, so that at least we have something on the continent to begin to guide institutions. So we were one of the leaders for the development of the key outcome document from the Second African Conference on Emerging Infectious Diseases and Biosecurity, which took place in Lagos, Nigeria in July 2016. And this is the groundbreaking Lagos Declaration and Call to Action on Science Communication and Public Learning and Understanding of Science in Africa. And this is the first document of its kind on our continent. And many institutions and many practitioners have found it very useful in terms of beginning to frame their actions, their practices, and the developing their footprint in different parts of the continent. So while we struggle with top-down approaches, our experience is that let us look at also what we can do bottom-up. The second pillar where we see these challenges is in practice and program development. So we find that science communication on the continent is struggling to decouple itself from the dominant Eurocentric norms, languages, and traditions that limit the impactful engagement of diverse African publics. And we see this most glaringly in what I called the crisis-led approach to inclusive science communication on our continent. So we wait until there's a crisis. Yeah. So if you think back to the Ebola epidemic that affected a number of West African countries between 2014 and 2016. And when we get into these crisis situations, what do we find? We find that there's a real disjuncture between Eurocentric approaches and the cultural norms and practices of African publics. We find this real profound conflict. And yet, it seems to me that it is only when things get so sharply in contrast that our African science communicators actually find the drive to take up Afrocentric science communication. So we found that during the Ebola crisis, when many of us went with these Eurocentric approaches, our people were not having it. It just wasn't working. And we only got change and we were only able to contain that epidemic when we actually took up the Afrocentric sociocultural norms and tools and approaches that the local people resonated with them, that actually spoke to their lived experiences. And that was very humbling. But we seem to only be able to do this when there's a crisis. Why? Why can't we do this as a routine?
Yeah, responsive.
Yeah. And again, doing sign communication in African languages. So the language context during the Ebola epidemic was very critical. You couldn't go there and be speaking English or French or whatever, because that wasn't resonating. That wasn't where most of the people in those local communities were coming from. And we saw that again during the COVID pandemic, where fortunately some of the lessons from the Ebola epidemic had been learned. And we were able to find that science communicators working with public health practitioners realized that they had to move very quickly into these Afrocentric, socioculturally appropriate tools and approaches. So, and in fact, some people have said that the reason why many African countries did so much better than their Western counterparts during the COVID pandemic was precisely because of those hard lessons, transformative lessons that we had learned from the Ebola epidemics beforehand. So African countries were actually better prepared for those inclusive, transformative approaches in science communication than their global northern counterparts. And the third pillar in which the challenge sits is that of capacity building. So we have African scientists and scholars being encouraged to share their research and to engage in science communication. But where do they get the knowledge, the skills, the aptitude? We're expecting them to give what they haven't got. And we have very few institutions that are taking up the challenge of capacity building for science communication, Afrocentric, transformative science communication, that is, on our continent. So here again, African Gong decided to be part of the solution rather than just waiting for others to come on board. And we have worked with partner institutions on the continent, such as the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, to conceptualize and deliver a very uniquely innovative Afrocentric program called Africa Scientific Leadership, Knowledge and Skills for Science Communication. And this is targeted at young and emerging scholars. And it is premised unapologetically on the core principles and philosophies of Afrocentricity, that is, mainstreaming African culture and contexts, African languages, sociocultural inclusion, African scientific culture, and innovation. And this program has been delivered since 2020 and has benefited STEM scholars from more than 12 African countries.
That is quite an impressive part, being part of the solution and working with the resources we have.
Yes. Rather than making excuses and waiting for everything to come top down. So our philosophy in African Gong is do what you can with what you have. We all have something, no matter how limited it is. And our empowerment philosophy is to say, as Africans, wherever we sit in these spaces, we need to empower ourselves to work with others. You can't do it alone. To work with others to see how we can work together to be change agents, to create solutions on our continent. Government can't do everything. In as much as we would want our governments to do more, the reality is government cannot do it all. We as practitioners, we as knowledge holders still need to take responsibility. Absolutely.
And Dr. Elizabeth, this has been such a rich conversation and a lot of sense making. And as we wrap up, what advice do you have for emerging science communicators and public engagement practitioners across the African continent?
Basically, to say that the starting point for them should always be to try and deepen their knowledge and understanding of the challenges that they're dealing with. So if you want to make change, if you want to take the system forward, you have to understand how things have come to be, and you need to take the time and the trouble to understand the historical and contemporary footprints and legacies of these challenges on the continent. Because my concern is that for many of our young people, and understandably so, they see things that are not as they should be. And there's a tendency to just want to lash out. Are you with me? Yeah, to lash out and not actually take the time to sit back to say, what is it I am saying? How did things get here? So a bit of what I call that strategic patience, to be able to actually take the time to learn and understand. And then strategic patience also means that they need to avoid the temptation of superficiality and quick fixes. There are no quick fixes here. These are long-standing issues and challenges we're dealing with. So they need to avoid the temptation of quick fixes through adopting tokenistic and extractive approaches, because that again only makes the problem worse. And secondly, I would really encourage them to understand that you cannot empower others if you are not empowered yourself. Just as you cannot take others to where you have never been. This means that they need to make a lifelong commitment to self-reflection, to reading, studying, and learning widely across disciplines so that they can push themselves outside the boundaries of their comfort zone. And finally, to take up leadership in driving forward change, so that within these contexts, they should see themselves as leaders. One of the things that strikes me on our continent, our young people are always quick to say, we're the leaders of the future. And I'm like, yes, but does it go beyond being a slogan? Are you with me? To something that you actually live and breathe in your daily life. So leadership is about taking responsibility. And here is an opportunity to go beyond sloganizing and to say, we are the youth, we are the future leaders of Africa. And to say, well, what does leadership mean? For me, as a scientist, as a scholar, as we engage and we try to inculcate in the Africa Scientific Capacity Building Program for science communicators, we get them to understand that leadership starts with you. Leadership starts with you going to your village or your community to share with them your research, your science, and to show them how that knowledge can help them to improve the quality of their lives. So like one of the alumni of the program in 2020 during the COVID era, who went back to her country in Swaziland and engaged with her church community to address issues of lack of trust in vaccinations. And she was able, through her public engagement activity, to convince so many of her church members to go and get the COVID vaccination. And in the process saved so many lives. She could have just gone back to her country with her knowledge and just kept it to herself. And what was so enrolling for the audiences that she engaged with in Swaziland, and they said to her, this is the first time that we have one of our own that goes out to study, to take up advanced study, and then you come back and you share it with us. You don't just keep it to yourself. So it was so moving for them that here was a young scholar, Tandiwe Dlamini, who came to South Africa to study and then went back to Swaziland and shared that knowledge using mathematical network theory to explain to them how how the COVID virus spreads, and therefore how vaccination can actually enable people to be better protected. And who would have thought that you could use mathematical network theory to explain? And she did it all in her local language. We have a wonderful video that Tandiwe sent us of her explaining mathematical network theory and COVID spread and vaccination. And she saved many lives of her church members. And that's leadership. And here's a young African woman scientist demonstrating, living that leadership. So that is my message to our young people, that you all need to be the Tandiwes of this continent, because we have huge developmental challenges on our continent, which, as I say, as a critical friend of science, science can help us to solve. But you are the youth, you are the future, and we need you to use your knowledge to help to drive that developmental progress.
It's a good way to end. A lot from my end, from what you were just speaking, there is a lot of reflection and walking the talk and reflection. It's such an iterative process that you just keep on learning, reflecting, doing, learning. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights in terms of your personal experience, professionally, how they've matched experience on the book, and what you're learning as you go. It is quite interesting to see, even with years of decades, it's always still a learning process. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for having me.